Oh, baby. It is the episode Doug Norrie has been waiting for. Draft Talk. We're going to take a look at the Brooklyn Nets prospects with the 23rd overall pick in the upcoming NBA draft. Will they keep it? Should they keep it? If they keep it, how should they use it? We break down all the key names and possibilities of how Sean Marks can improve the Brooklyn Nets going into a championship caliber season. We think once again, all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Sir, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, DraftKings, FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen, free on all those great platforms. And of course, let you know today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. And Doug, where we start. Come on, buddy. Say it with me. NBA draft. You know you've been dying for it.
No, you know what? I don't think about, follow college basketball and stuff. Don't think too much about the draft until right now. Like this is when, but that's okay because this is when we start doing a deep dive into, where the Nets are going to be, where we kind of have an idea where they might land, but then we're going to talk today about, how that might not be the case. So it is an interesting situation going into the draft. We're joking around. I do like the draft because I like to see where these teams end up landing. It's just when it comes to, breaking down some of the prospects, it's cool. And I get a little worried because like when the Nets are good, like it's going to be, you got to do a deeper dive on it. So yeah, this is cool. There's a lot to get into today with this because the Nets do have a really, really interesting decision to make even just before the draft starts.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, tongue in cheek a little bit off the top, but as we know, I mean, we've opened the door a little bit behind the Giants podcast. Like and even on NBA related, I get excited about young players. So like I can convince myself that at 23, like based on Nets track record, some other guys around the league, I go, no. There is a guy here that you could see in the starting lineup when it comes to the playoffs next season. So it's awesome to do it. It just does become interesting when we talk about the Brooklyn Nets because we haven't really had as much in these areas to discuss. Even last year, it ends up working out really well, I think, for the Nets in getting Cam Thomas. We thinking and also what Day'Ron Sharpe can be potentially for this team. But that was also a time when we discussed it being, are the Nets going to try to trade out, right? Do they not want to be locked into picks here? So often a product of making a championship team is sacrificing quote unquote assets to get known commodities. So when we now look at the Brooklyn Nets in the upcoming draft, 23rd pick acquired in the trade with the Philadelphia 76ers, the first big question becomes, should they keep it? Because they do have the option to push this off to next season. So that's phase one. Will the Nets have a pick in the upcoming draft? Should they hold on to 23?
Yeah, this is an interesting decision they have to make here because with the Simmons trade, right? They had a first round pick came along with it. They could defer, right? So they could defer to the next season, and so it really becomes a matter of a couple things. One, and I think that the decision needs to be made pretty soon here. One is whether or not they just think that the draft pick will be better next year, right? Like right now it's 23, and you're asking yourself, what are the Philadelphia 76ers prospects for next year? Are they going to be a better team, worse team? So could that pick more likely land in, the top 20 range next year? That's an interesting dice roll, and I can see both sides of it. And then you think to yourself, well, what could they do with the pick this year? Like, is the draft class stacked enough now to we'll talk about some of these guys in a minute here, like grab somebody that they could maybe just help now. I will say the Nets have a good history of drafting. And so, especially in lower slots where they've just kind of, they're the guy where they've slotted guys, the guys who tend to outperform the draft slot in the aggregate. Not every guy's a home run. And then what can you package together? So I'm not exactly sure where 100% I land on this one because I think there are a lot of moving parts. But I mean, where do you stand just right now? Like, would you like to just see him keep it? Like, where would you stand here? Because I can definitely make a case for and against really every scenario.
Yeah, yeah, that's the best part. Is like I'd be like, well, if you wanted to go this route, but there's been a lot of indications that it's maybe more likely than not that they would want to defer it to next year.
Yeah.
I tend to go on the other side of it though, because while Philadelphia, it's certainly not a foregone conclusion that they're going to be one of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference, but where they finished and being 23rd this year versus what's going to happen next year. I mean, we know that they're in a reload, tinker with this roster, make themselves better. Like I would anticipate that the 76ers are deeper in the playoffs next year than where they exited this particular season. And just by that simple math, I would say that combined with if you think that this year's class is as deep or relative at 23 to what you're going to see in next year's draft class, that would be the argument to say, yeah, use it now because it's only going to become more diminished as time goes on here, looking ahead to the next draft class. There is another factor as far as the timing of it because they need to make this choice. We should say by June 1, they have to commit to what they're going to do. Are they going to defer this pick or are they going to keep it? And then the draft will come up a little bit later next month. So they do have a timeline here of having to make this choice. In the moment, I say if you think the talent is there in the draft, you utilize. And there's going to be a couple of ways they can go about it. But I don't think that the Nets are so locked and set at all of their key positions of need that you can go, you know what? We'll see next year about adding in pieces, let alone we know what the finances are right now.
And right, and this is the other key piece is like how do you rebuild a roster where you're already over the tax? You know you're going to continue to be over it because you're going to have probably re-sign Kyrie. So that money, even if they didn't sign Kyrie, excuse me, excuse me, even if they didn't re-sign Kyrie, they're over the tax.
Choked up talking about Kyrie.
Yeah, even without him, right? Like so they need functional ways to save money and with guys that can like potentially just round out a 12-man roster, right? So like this is where the draft does begin to help you is that because the guys just come in cheap and you can hopefully maybe start developing a little bit. If you get a little bit of run out of them, that's a win also, like we saw with Kessler and even Cam this season. And even guys like Sharp and Duke who got some time, like you do want to be able to try to get them on the court. And there really is no other cheaper way to do it than the draft, especially around these slots. So this is the idea around keeping it because, to go another year without other young players, like eventually, I mean, look, they would get it next year. So it's maybe not one or the other, but to go years without getting any draft picks and developing guys like does come back to bite you. Like you end up paying that price later. It's like, maybe you won't feel it now, but just look at teams that haven't historically drafted well or haven't had a ton of picks. Like that catches up with you at some point because you can't buy your team through free agency forever. Like you can try and it gets a little harder each time. Like we saw it last year. It's like, yeah, they got a bunch of like veteran guys and a lot of them were long in the tooth. And just by the time the end of the season came, like they just really weren't able to contribute, right? That gets a little more difficult every single year when you can't bring along young guys. So this is the case too for keeping it now and just saying, and this is even if they didn't package it or move up or package it for another player, like all the stuff that can work in your favor. I do sometimes think that it's probably better to take what you have now. Look, is Philly going to be better next year? I mean, they're definitely going to be in the playoffs. Like if they re-sign Harden for like all the problems that this team had when it came to the playoffs, the team is too good. Like they'll definitely make the playoffs. Like that's 100% between Embiid, Harden, and Maxey. Like you're in the playoffs. Like I think there's almost no doubt about that. Now, how far they go is another question, but it's hard to imagine them being like so much worse, barring some kind of injury. So I think those factors for me, I think start to line up and say, hey, let's just do it now. We know what we have, but I don't. And like I said, we'll know in a week or two. But it'd also be more fun for the draft if they just had it. So,
yeah. By the way, we've done things where there's great, like the entire Locked On Network. They do great draft coverage, and I have sat there doing diligent. We sat there doing diligent note taking. The prospects, who's it going to be? Breaking these guys down, all to have the Nets 2 years ago completely trade out of it. And you go,
oh, cool. They traded for Landry Shamet. Well, I guess that's going to be in our spot on the draft show.
Yep. It was like, what do you think about Landry? And it was like, totally, guys. But and the other factor would be before we get into some of the mechanics around, you said like packaging it, using it maybe with a trade exemption, etc., would be that the benefit. I think it sounds like we're both on the same page of they should keep it and utilize it in this draft because you just don't know what's going to happen down the line. You could have a clearer picture a year from now around what is maybe the last missing piece and can you utilize that asset in a trade for a known commodity, etc. But again, what that looks like a year from now, you don't know the holes that you're going to have by then either, right? Like things are going to be different. You're going to be another year removed from certain players who are coming off of injuries, or guys that are older, like a Patty Mills, who's currently, we think, going to be in on the player option. So what you need now may not be what you need a year from now. So waiting to see could end up being, hey, now we have 3 holes and we still only have 1 draft pick. The other piece that we talk about, though, is of course utilizing this pick and getting a known commodity in the NBA. I'll bring up a name for Doug to throw at, for Doug to dissect, I should say, that the Nets could look to target here coming up in a second. But right after we tell you about, of course, our friends over at Sakara. That is because, as you know, Sakara is about feeling your best, and it starts with what you eat. Sakara helps you live a healthy, balanced lifestyle and truly enjoy it with delicious, plant-rich, transformational nutrition that builds a foundation for living in your best body. That's me, baby. I'm on a path to my best body. It might not look like it now, but just you wait. With Sakara, I'm going to get there. That's because Sakara is a wellness company anchored in food and medicine, as medicine, I should say, and on a mission to nourish your body through the power of plants. You can go, of course, and look at their nutritionally designed, chef-crafted breakfast, lunches, and dinners that are made with powerful plant-rich ingredients, helping boost your energy, support your digestion, curb your sugar cravings, and get your skin to that silky smooth glow. And right now, of course, Sakara is offering our listeners 20% off on their first order when they go to sakara.com/locked-on20 or enter code locked-on20 at checkout. That's Sakara, SAKARA.com/locked-on20 to get 20% off your first order. Sakara.com/locked-on20. So then, Doug,
Wait, real quick before you get into this trade thing. Sorry, I cut you off because I know I don't want to like turn back around in a second here. So I just want to say one more thing about one more thing about one more case to defer it, and then
Okay.
we'll move
Sure.
on. The one other case to defer it would be that by June 1st, you just don't know where the rest of your team is right now. Like you
That's
don't
fair.
like Kyrie, you don't, for as much as we think Kyrie is coming back and on an extension or opt in, whatever, like by June 1st, they're not going to know that, right? They're not going to know Ben Simmons's health status by June 1st, right? They're not going to know Joe Harris and Seth Curry's health status by June 1st. Like there's a lot of unknowns on this team by the time that the pick rolls around, that the case for deferring it would be like, hey, maybe hopefully next year we just have a better sense of where we are as a whole team. Because right now they I mean, as much as you think what you know is going to happen, hey, these guys are going to be full recoveries, Kyrie's going to sign an extension, like that's going to be the case. You just really don't know yet. And so the case for deferring would be, hey, we just don't know enough. There's enough question marks around there. Claxton, Bruce Brown, like all these guys. Like that was remiss by not even mentioning them. Like you don't even know if those guys are coming back because you haven't signed them, right? So like they are by June 1st are going to have question marks around. I mean, I just listed 6 guys that they're not going to be sure about, plus guys like Drummond, plus all the vets. Like there might just be a case where you say, hey, I don't know enough about my current team to make a good functional draft decision, except for like best player available. And that might not be a good move, right? So like that'd be my only other case that I kind of just didn't kind of glossed over at the time of the decision, is that, okay, cool, we'd have Kevin Durant. Everything else is a question mark.
Well, to your point, maybe it's a little bit of optimistic thinking about it's like about maybe they already know what they're going to do with certain things, like the Bruce Browns, the Nicholas Claxtons, other things you can't know, like the health of Ben Simmons, but like Kyrie, right? Maybe internally they already have it. They already have a lot of these things checked off. I don't necessarily see how that could be the case. But to your point, when you have, if it's 7 questions this year and it could be 3 questions next off season, that can make a difference about having that extra asset and being able to utilize it. So it's fair. I still fall on the side of keeping it, but we'll see how it plays out.
I think I might have changed my mind on this one because like
I know, you know what? It was a compelling case. You came in with the bonus, the bonus tidbit did sway me around the idea of, that's what the question is though. Let's stay on it for a second. Did they already know we're committed to bringing back Bruce Brown? We're committed to bringing back Nicholas Claxton. We feel fairly confident that Patty Mills either is or is not coming back on his player option.
Right.
Are we planning on bringing back Dragic, right? So if they internally have answers to some of these questions that we can only speculate on right now, then obviously that'll influence what they do as far as deferring it or not. If all of these things are open, which it's probably more likely than not that it is, because there's a lot of factors there, then the deferring certainly comes into play.
I think there's just too many. I think even if they quote unquote know what they're going to do or know what they want to do, there's still just too many question marks. I mean, now that we roll through it, literally every single guy on the roster right now is a question mark except for Durant, right? Like, and I guess no, yeah, because if you factor in health, like I don't think there's another guy, and the rookies like Cam and Kessler, like you're bringing them back, right? Outside of those guys, you can label a question around just about every single other player on the thing. So even if they thought they knew what they wanted to do, I think there's just too many. There's still just too many moving parts.
Well, and see the case that I would put in as well to keep Ian moving forward with is kind of your point. It's like, what's the only thing you know for sure on the roster? It's Kevin Durant, and he also happens to be the most important thing on the roster. In that regard, you can probably also make decisions around what do we want to do from a prospect standpoint. If there's a guy in the draft that makes sense to complement Kevin Durant, then everything else doesn't matter. But it is all relative to what do we think about how we want to build this team short and long term around Kevin Durant. So you could certainly look at it that way. I still fall on the side of keeping it, but it's
well, let me throw in one more. Let me throw in one more thing. Now we're getting far afield because it's funny, but I started this with like a pretty firm idea of what I want to do, but now I'm actually walking myself all the way back. There's one more thing there's one more reason to keep it. Okay. The other reason to keep it and wait till next year is because with all these moving parts, there is a world.
So you mean defer it? You're saying defer it.
Sorry, defer it. Sorry. Yeah, what to defer it to next year. My bad. Yeah, I know I get confused. To defer it to next year is that there's a world where like the Simmons thing doesn't work out or something like that. And you actually need assets to move off of some of this stuff where like you need a first round draft pick to move off of something. Like, and I don't mean bringing something in, like,
just getting rid of something, dumpstering a bad asset.
There could be. Sometimes you got to attach something to get rid of something you don't want anymore. And that's the other part too. Like, it's not just about bringing in guys. It could be about like sending guys off. Like I said, if the Simmons thing doesn't work out. So there's just I said this 5 times now, but like now I've given myself enough reasons to defer it, I think, because I think the amount of question marks is too many.
Well, now, and so this actually, as we start segment 2, the other decision that they could make is utilizing that pick in conjunction with some of their other assets in order to go acquire a proven commodity right now. Yeah. And the way that we looked at this was when you look at this right now, we obviously know that they have some significant trade exemptions. One from the James Harden, which is $11.3 million. That doesn't expire until beginning of February 2023. And then you also have expiring this summer, which can be a factor, is the 6.2, nearly 6.3 from DeAndre Jordan's trade. That expires in mid-August 2022. So the other way that you can go about this is to say, how can I go and utilize these trade exemptions, understanding that you don't just go to a team and offer up a trade exemption, say, hey, we'll use our exemption, we'll take the player, and we're not really planning on giving you anything back. Now, if you're planning on keeping status quo at the outside shooter spots with Joe Harris and with Seth Curry, but big decision about Andre Drummond. Are they going to bring him back or not? What does it look like? And can you ultimately improve that spot? Because there's been far too much, hey, we have guys that can play about 20, 25 minutes. They're not great in a lot of matchups, etc. Can you just improve it where you have a higher level of consistency? An example for this that came to mind was at the trade deadline, Pirtle for the Spurs was being talked about as a trade target. The Spurs at the time were saying that they wanted a first-round pick for him. The Nets could use the trade exemption, not have to bring anything in additionally on the cap, and then send the 23rd overall pick to the Spurs in order to bring back in a player that you would think upgrades that position for the Nets. This isn't the end-all be-all of recommendations. There's actually another player on the Spurs that I think could work in this scenario well, and maybe even better from a skill standpoint. But just overall, and you can mention the Spurs too, how do you feel about the idea of packaging up 23 and using a trade exemption to get a proven commodity now that no matter what you think you're going to learn over the next year, this is a guy that can be a part of what we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny about him. So it's funny. He is better than any center the Nets currently have, and I'm going to include Claxton in that, right? So, like, on the one hand, he's not probably as good he's a pretty good defender though. He's not probably as good like in switchability stuff, but he's bigger and he just has more size. He's a proven he can get on the glass. He's a pretty good like just post scorer. I'm not sure how important that is really for the Nets or like just their overall like championship equity going forward, but he would clearly be an upgrade on everybody. My only problem with a guy like that, and I'm not opposed to this idea of getting players with these exceptions and even packaging a mid first round pick for a sort of proven commodity, knowing what you are, even if that commodity is not like a top 30 NBA player or whatever.
This is where you kind of need to live, right? Because you can't.
Yeah. I'm realistic about this. Like that would be, I actually think it's like not enough to get him, frankly. But let's say it was, and you could do it. He's just kind of like not the guy that I would want, only because we just have this other. At this point, I think the Nets, and we'll talk about this with some of this trade stuff, like, or the draft stuff too, is that like they have to just find guys that can live in like the 3 to 5 range. And I mean like small forward to center range, and not guys that can only live in the 5 range. And that's what Pirtle is, right? Like he's only a 5. He's nothing else. Like he cannot move down. He's just a center. And I think at this point, with the way the Nets are constructed, they have to only target guys that can live across a few different positions, either offensively or defensively. Like it can be both, it can be either, but they just can't lock themselves into another just 5. They have enough 5s. They have Claxton, they have Sharp. They brought back, I mean, they wouldn't bring back Drummond in this scenario, but like and I guess that would be my answer for all these kind of scenarios, is that if they have to, like I always say, like the reason I'm using numbers is like it's good to think about players in forms of numbers, because if you want them to exist on a spectrum, like Kyrie is like a 1 or a 2, can only guard 1s, right? Like Drummond is a 5 and can only guard 5s. Like Kevin Durant is like a weirdly like a 2 through 5, right? Okay, so like because he can guard,
don't know what position he starts as and what he can defend,
right? Because he's so good. And like the best players exist along those spectrums. So I'd be a little concerned about bringing in a guy that's hold that one thought, because we're going to get to a couple of these other scenarios, and we'll touch on a little of the draft here. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online, the #1 source for all of your betting needs and sports info. On betonline.net, you find the latest odds, all the sports developments. You can get to the playoffs this year. A lot of blowouts in the playoffs this year. Bet Online, I don't think any of the books have seen this coming really with how many blowouts there have been, but that's been the case. They got Major League Baseball, got the fights, they got NFL futures. It's all there for you on Bet Online. You go to betonline.net, you learn all about the trends, all the different betting action. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Okay, so the quick one was just on the Spurs, and then I want to actually offer you something like we didn't talk about in the front end, but a Zach Collins, who also falls underneath the trade exemption. He, more of a 4 than a 5, and less attractive, obviously, than a Pirtle, but maybe something that a play. I'm using him as the example, right? Maybe a player in that range that could function for the Nets too. The downside would be you have to use the higher trade exemption because it's over top of DeAndre Jordan's number, but it's well below the number for James Harden. So, once you use these trade exemptions, you don't get to say, then I'll use the leftover change for another thing over here. You only get one shot with it, which I think does factor into guys that you would be targeting.
Yeah, he's definitely more versatile. He's had crazy bad injury stuff. Like he sat out the entire year. I think it was an Achilles for him. But he sat out all last season, barely played this year too. Once they brought him back, he was on a strict minutes thing too for a long time. Can stretch the floor in a way Pirtle can't, does not have the size that Pirtle does. So there's a little more versatility. I mean, people were really dreaming on his skills when he was at Portland, but then, like I said, the injury stuff just kind of has submarined a little bit. He's still super young. That one would be more interesting as an upside play, and you'd hope that he can come back and just be healthy and start to realize some of what people believed he could be when he was on the Blazers. Because he was he wasn't. I mean, he was a top 10 pick. So this was a guy that people thought was going to turn into something.
Yeah.
It just hasn't happened because of injuries and other stuff.
Bringing another guy with some injury history. Let's just, let's really.
I'm not opposed to injury history if you're buying low and if you think there's just been some run bad in it. I mean, it's never usually good, but there's a reason these guys have become their value's been depressed. It's because they've been injured. You can be okay on this at times. If it was just kind of fluky stuff. Now, sometimes injuries beget injuries, and that's just what ends up happening in the cascades. For a lower number, I'd be fine taking a risk on a guy like this, just because if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. But there's a world where it's oh, we really got something here, because this is what the Nets need to be. Really, the Nets need to be in a form now of buying on guys whose value's been depressed to the point where they just don't have tons anymore for whatever reason, and hope you get lucky. I think that's sort of the world where they need to live. They don't have enough stuff to really reshape a roster without just taking some swings. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. They just need to be, but the swings just can't be on these veteran old dudes anymore. The swings have to be on, hey, was once good, has had a bunch of stuff that's gone wrong. We see potential. Guys like this come out of the place all the time. Isaiah Hartenstein's a good example. Guys come out of the place, they move around a lot, and then all of a sudden they just are good again, right?
And,
Like,
and a great point on Zach Collins is that he has 2 years left on his contract. So if you're
right.
buying low on him, then you also have a little bit of control, and then that money can maybe start to reshape where you can pay him and keep him around long term. Before I want to get to a couple of draft prospects here, and also a philosophical question around the Brooklyn Nets. But the other one I just wanted to throw out too here quickly, as I thought this episode might get a little bit expansive. But when we talk about packaging the pick to accomplish something, this works on paper. I'm putting it out there as for instance, a lot of Nets fans have talked about wanting a player like Miles Turner. The Joe Harris and pick 23 for Miles Turner scenario where the money matches up and you're obviously giving up an asset to acquire him. Probably maybe not enough to get him, but is Joe Harris still have the value? Is Seth Curry, insert player X or Y here, maybe off the Nets roster to make it work from a money and personnel standpoint. But would you be interested in the Nets trying to take a bigger swing like that to get what feels like let's really accomplish the full goal here, as opposed to a buy low scenario, a sort of fits, but not necessarily going to be the end all be all.
Yeah, I mean, he's another one that's been in like as many trade machine queries as probably like anybody in the NBA over the last
Yeah.
few years. Miles Turner, like everyone's wanted to trade for him. The Pacers have not traded him. They traded Sabonis instead. Now, part of that was injury. Like he got injured last season, and they might have wanted to trade it, and the market might have cratered because he got injured before the trade deadline. And so when that happens, it's like you can't like no contending team is going to do it because you can't contend with them. So that could have been the reason, but they did move on from Sabonis instead of Turner. I don't think. I mean, he's only got 1 year left on the contract, so he's an expiring. And I do think the Nets probably don't have enough to get him. He also just like might be part of their long-term plans. Like I don't really know. Like they moved off of Sabonis and kept him. So there's a world where they see a world like where they want to just re-sign him and not trade him. I know he's been speculated about being traded. I wouldn't be opposed to bringing him in. He can stretch the floor. He's great weak side shot blocker. Like he's a really good player. There's a reason he's been in a lot of trade machine scenarios. I do think that if they actually just put him all the way up on the block and he came out of the gate like healthy. See, this is the other thing too. He ended the season injured. Like I don't know. I mean, how many like this is like I'm all for taking risks, but this is another one where it's like I don't know. So I actually don't think this one's that realistic.
Yeah, and moreover, just being the idea of hey, packaging a player of better value, packaging some bigger money on the Nets roster. Like these are things that they can explore, but as we've highlighted before this offseason, the dollars aren't always one-to-one just because you remove one. It doesn't mean you could do this for a low-level player like a Pirtle and then turn around and say, and now we just have infinitely more cap room underneath it because we don't have Joe Harris on the books at 18, 19 million, right? So these things aren't one-to-one, but it's interesting to consider. The other one, then, when we talk about the draft options for the Brooklyn Nets, we're going to touch on a couple of names here, but I also, who knows, maybe this will end up being something we get to on another episode, because philosophically, what are the Nets? What do you think the Nets should be doing if they're at 23, if they're in this draft class? So much of the conversation is we need a guy to play at the 5. We need a guy that's big, that can rebound, etc. But I did start to have a little bit of a thought process around, well, what do they really need most? Like, where is the highest level of value for this team to be athletic, to be versatile, and to be dynamic around Kevin Durant? It doesn't necessarily equal, to your point, a Pirtle, a guy that rebounds, plays a true 5, and doesn't have a lot of range thereafter.
Yeah, so there's competing philosophies when you're at this point in the draft. It's like the one is just take best player available. Don't worry about fit. There's a very unlikely chance they're going to come in and just like start right. They're not going to start right away, and they're probably not going to be a rotation player at that point. Just take the best guy and see what you can turn him into. The other philosophy is to take the most NBA ready guy, right? And so sometimes the most NBA ready guy doesn't necessarily mean the best guy, because they might have reached sort of like getting close to their ceiling already, but they're not going to be a superstar, but they can come in and play. A very good example of this was 2 years ago with Desmond Bane. Like we talked and when we were talking about, the Nets on that draft point, they ended up trading out of that spot. Right. But we were like, oh, Desmond Bane. And by the way, I went back and listened specifically to our podcast about this just to make sure the receipts were on this one. And we were like, that guy is NBA ready body. Now he can come in and play now. I don't know if he's gonna be a superstar, but he will definitely play out of the gate for the Nets. That was 100% correct. And you could see it when you watched his game, right? Like you could see that, like, because he was he was a senior, the body was developed, like he was already strong as hell. And he checked all those boxes already. Now he's actually gotten even better than I thought he was going to be. But point being, that was not necessarily best upside guy available, that was like most ready guy now. So I think there are some examples in the draft like where we could look for some of these guys that fit just high upside dudes, or guys that could maybe come in and contribute. My only thing, if the Nets were to keep this pick and just use it for themselves, I cannot get on board where they draft the center. You can just get centers on the market. Like, they have to draft a wing. Like, have to draft, if they're trying to just fit for need, it has to be like a guy 6'7" or above, has shown even an inkling they can shoot. Does not have to have done it yet, but like they can't have taken no 3-pointers in college, right? Like, they have to, like, there has to be something like that. I can't get on board, I don't think, with just drafting like some 7'1" interior post play prospect. And like, I just don't, that's just not what they need. So
it philosophically goes so much against what they want to do, right? We saw how they benefited when they can get out and run more. It just, from the LaMarcus Aldridge versus even having a Drummond, just a guy that's more athletic. Or as Claxton came along, it was like, oh, right, they can run more at pace. They can push the tempo. That's what Kyrie likes to do when he's in the offensive set as well. Let's put this one name. I think let's just put the one name on paper that I think you and I both, when we said, hey, look at these prospects, who do we like? We both came to EJ Liddell as being an ideal fit. You mentioned it. 6'7", 7-foot wingspan. So we always know the wingspan matters. 240 pounds. Everything about his game is kind of what you're speaking to. Not the full outside range, but he's showcased that he has the mid-range shot. He obviously plays a little bit above his size on the interior. Versatile defensively. Looks like he knows how to work the pass, make smart basketball decisions on the offensive end. Like, this is the kind of guy that you can flex and use in a few different spots and still be effective and immediately. There's a role for this player as the Nets are currently constituted going into next year.
Yeah, like, he's a guy that I think probably could come in and contribute. I think like the 37% from 3 is probably a little misleading, because like sometimes it's better to look a little bit at like free throw percentage, and his free throw percentage was a little worse than you would want it to be, which means that he might not be as great of a shooter as the first number would suggest. Either way, other good signs for him is that he absolutely got after it on the defensive end, at least in the counting stuff, and like that is a good sign that the effort was there. Like, I'm not saying he's necessarily like a great on-ball defender, but if you are like leading in block shots and stuff like that for your college team, you are at least like, the effort is there for you, that you want to like contribute at that end. And that cannot be said for every single guy, especially if they're tasked with a lot of the scoring duties for their team. So that's, again, that's not like a high level breakdown of just what his on ball skills are. It's just a good signal that, he cared enough about that end to get after it, at least on like the weak side and stuff. So he's raw. And like, you could see like being mistake prone, but there are guys like this. There are enough guys like this in this range, I think, like either between him. I mean, I'll just throw out a couple names because we got to get out of here. We're gonna go. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say maybe we probably find a way to put these into a couple episodes.
We'll throw these guys in later, especially if they keep him. But like Jovic, who's gonna be confused with Nikola Jokic for the rest of his life, because there's one letter off for their whole name. He's an interesting prospect that's big, that can shoot a little bit, even at 6'11". Kendall Brown is a nice wing from Baylor, but the shooting is really not there at all for him. I don't know if you had a couple more guys. Like, there are guys. I guess the point is there are guys in this range that it's like you can squint and see it by when you look at them drafting it.
The funny thing was, like, Kendall Brown, definitely, and he's athletic. He's a good looking prospect. He's also 6'11" wingspan. He's 6'8", but he's 205 pounds. So you just like, I'm like, no, we have too many rail thin bodies on this team. Like, I need someone who's a little bit thicker, but he still is a nice prospect. I'll have to forgive me if I mispronounce his last name, who played over in Paris, Ishmael Kamagate. I'm going to say Kamagate. That's probably not 100% accurate, but he's 6'11", 230. He's a bigger guy, but that has shown the ability to put the ball on the court, attack slower defenders. He's been working on his outside game. Again, NBA ready body, because he's already been playing at a professional level of basketball. Like, that's a guy who's closer to the 30 range, but I think this is where you can say, Sean Marks, the Brooklyn Nets, they've shown the ability to go find a player. So if you're there, and the one thing that we didn't actually need to talk about on this one is the Nets could also trade out of 23. The Nets could trade back in the first round, get a later first round pick, and maybe pick up another asset for the future. Like, that may be one of the most attractive scenarios for them, where they then can still target one of these prospects that they think could be either, immediate impact or developmental, because it is all about the short and long-term game.
For sure. So there's a lot of different options here. Like I said, I think I'm probably in the end, just to put a cap on it, I think I'm going to defer. I'm going to defer to them deferring because because I just think there's in thinking about it, I just think there are probably too many moving parts just organizationally by the time they need to make the decision. Remember, they're not making the decision by the draft. They're making this decision by June 1st, right? So it's a totally different thing. Like they have to they don't even have they can't even, be helped with time on this one. They just have to make it before they're going to have a lot of this stuff ironed out. All right. We're going to get into more of this week. I'm sure we got some other Kevin Durant stuff we're going to talk about this week. Also, he had some interesting quotes about coaching. We're looking at more coaching turnover within the Nets brass too, which is really showing some weird signs of upheaval on the bench. So that's might get a little weird here. That stuff we're going to cover this week. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Over 2,300 subscribers. Thank you so much to everyone that's jumped over there. We'll be coming at you 5 days a week, all the way at least through the draft. So we're going to be here just with you, and make sure you are with us by subscribing over on YouTube.
And I am a package that pick and try to use it with the trade exemption, just in case we're wondering. But we'll see what happens, friends. Ultimately, I shall pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, of any kindness that I can show to any human being, let me do it now. Let me not defer it or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. Stephen Gerrard.
Oh, R.I.P. Don't know. Never heard of him. All right. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.